On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in the performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. Further support is provided by Charlotte Mecklenburg Library, one of America's leading urban public libraries, delivering exceptional services and programs with a mission to improve lives and build a stronger community. And by the Arts and Science Council, Charlotte Mecklenburg's resource hub and lead advocate for the regional cultural community, providing culture for all.
The leaving process, I wish more ethnographers wrote about that publicly. It's depression. A lot of people go in there, and the work that folks are in there doing, when you leave, there's an incredible amount of guilt in there, right? It's not something that's taken lightly at all. It's not something that I took lightly. And it's not something that any ethnographer that you speak to, we call it getting out. Getting out is hell. Getting in is easier than getting out. So getting out is intense. So we don't take that lightly at all.
Joseph Piko Ewoodzie examines how marginalized populations in urban locations make sense of inequalities in their everyday lives. Piko is the Malcolm O. Partin Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and Sociology at Davidson College. He teaches courses on qualitative methods, sociological theory, culture, race, and urban sociology. His publications include articles on the everyday eating patterns of people inhabiting different social classes and the book Breakbeats in the Bronx, Revisiting Hip-Hop's Early Years. In this episode, we explore urban sociology, qualitative research, managing feelings that arise, leaving marginalized people behind, the movie Black Panther, and more. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. Welcome, Piko.
Thank you so much.
You are a professor of sociology. You've described your work as, quote, using qualitative methods to examine how marginalized populations in urban locales make sense of inequalities in their everyday lives, end quote. What does that mean?
What does that mean? To me, I'm interested in people who live in urban areas who are facing all sorts and all kinds of inequalities. Now, what I'm most interested in the very mundane aspect of their day-to-day lives, how do they make sense of their daily lives as they're going through those inequalities? And so if you're facing housing inequalities, for example, if you're being evicted or if you're homeless, for example, what does the day-to-day just going about your day life actually look like? And what does that mean? I'm also really interested in, what do you come to think about yourself? Who do you imagine yourself to be in this world? How do you relate to other people, perhaps people who are going through the same things or people who are doing much better than you are? How do you sort of organize your lives to face the thing that you're going through, but also, imagine of a next day or a future or your kids and so my job as a qualitative researcher is to get as close as possible to the lives of people who are going through the icky stuff, the really horrible stuff that some of us just talk about. I want to get as close to those lives as possible and try to make sense of how people who are going through inequalities think about themselves and think about the stuff that they're going through.
Why are you interested in the lives of, quote, marginalized people in urban locations?
Yeah. So before I went to graduate school, I spent 1 year at Colgate University. And this is one of those, certain things happen and, I'm a churchy person, right? My father's a preacher. My grandfather's a preacher. I grew up in the church. And so I feel like I have had these moments where there's somebody that comes and says something that sort of sticks with me for a long time. this professor, he came to Colgate to give a talk. And then afterwards, he was supposed to have meetings with students. Now, I was a graduate and I was just working in the res life, but something told me go to this meeting. I show up to this meeting and nobody else was there. So it just became me and him talking, and he's incredibly well accomplished. And so I asked him, like, what's the secret? What's the thing that, and what he said was something that's always stuck with me. And he says, everybody's going to talk about social issues, but not as many people are going to get as close to it as possible. All you have to do is just get super close to it and come back and tell us what you did. And that's going to be the really interesting, brilliant work that you do. And that's always stuck with me. And so that's kind of where it came from. In terms of other intellectual inspirations, a lot of people will cite Du Bois as an important person for a whole host of reasons. Mine is that that's what he did in the cities. His first classic book, Philadelphia Negro. I mean, this is the Harvard educated. You think about your sort of pristine gentleman, 3-piece suit and a top hat, the whole nine. But when he wanted to understand life among Black folks in Philadelphia, he walked the streets and he knocked door to door, and he got to know people in this, I think, the 7th Ward, and he got to know them like person by person. And that's always been incredibly fascinating to me. And then there are, a whole host of other people who do that. And I think when they go in and they come back, the stuff that they tell us doesn't just help us understand the lives of people who are in those spaces, but when it's done particularly well, it even helps the people better understand their own lives, right? And so those are some of the inspirations to doing this.
We will explore the intimate work that you do in the streets, understanding the people that you care about. But first, I want to ask, what are the courses that you teach?
I teach contemporary race theory. I teach HipHop and Urban Sociology. I teach qualitative research methods. I teach a funky class called the Sociology of Beatty's Ford Road. I teach a course on housing. Yeah, I think that's so far what's in my catalog. I have other, next semester I'm teaching a course on the sociology of the South. So those are the courses that I teach.
Let's take a few of those courses in turn. You mentioned the course HipHop and Urban Sociology. The name seems to give it away. But what does the course examine?
So HipHop and Urban Sociology invites students to think about 4 of the most pressing problems, social problems that urban Americans are facing. The 4 pressing problems include housing and residential segregation, economic inequality, crime, violence, and punishment, and inequalities in intimate life. It's my favorite class that I teach and that I take. Each student is assigned a rapper. So if you were in the course, I would probably assign you a rapper that's close to where you're from, around North Carolina. So I would probably assign you J. Cole or Rhapsody. And as the course goes on, I will be telling you the national level understanding about housing and residential segregation, for example. I will tell you the national trends. I will tell you some of the ways that the best social scientists are trying to make sense of those things. Your job is to figure out how people in the city that your rapper is from, how those people are dealing with that particular problem. So if we're thinking and talking about housing and residential segregation, you would be thinking about, if you had J. Cole, you'd be looking at Fayetteville, but because I wanted a bigger urban space, I'll probably assign you Charlotte. So you'd be looking at housing and residential segregation in Charlotte. And at the end of each of those units, you will write to me a memo that tells me, here's, the national conversation and the larger story that I taught them in class. They teach me what's happening in each of those cities. And so it's often 32 students. And so we cover about 25 cities. There are some cities that are so big that you have to assign more than one students to it. So in New York City, you have somebody in Brooklyn, Queens, Harlem, and so on. And it becomes this wonderful conversation about what's happening all over America. So we learn about that in housing and residential segregation. We learn about economic inequality, especially wealth inequality, and how to overcome that. Now that economic mobility is really interesting, that's one of those conversations that we have. In Crime, Violence, and Punishment, we talk about what are different cities dealing with, not just incarceration rates, but also thinking about how do we reintegrate people who have spent their time incarcerated. When they come back to society, what do we do with them? And then probably one of my favorite units is the inequalities in intimate life. We learn about marriage rates, divorce rates, and even more interestingly, because thanks to online dating, we have a lot of data about, well, who gets picked, who gets liked, who gets swiped to the right, who gets swiped to the left. And we have rates on that. And we learn that Black women and Asian men are at the bottom of the pickings in those things. And what does that mean? Why do certain people get married more? Why do certain people get married less? Why do people get liked more? Why do people get liked less? And how does even something as personal as who we choose to date, how does all of that amount to the larger inequalities that we're trying to figure out in the classroom?
I imagine you're listening to songs as well.
Of course. And so as we go through all of this, the big question, the larger question always is, how are sociologists and social scientists talking about these problems? And how are hip hop artists talking about these problems? The super extra fun, and this is more in the pedagogical sense, it's just to really get all of us to listen to a lot of music and also just enjoy hip hop music. We have a 32-seated bracket. Think the NCAA brackets. So each student's MC is in this bracket. And at the beginning of a lot of our classes, there's a battle between two MCs. You play a song, I play a song. The students vote as to who advances. And at the end of each semester, we crown a champion for the hip-hop brackets.
And who have been your champions?
So last year, for the first time since I've been teaching this class, and I've taught it across two institutions for maybe 6 or 7 years, last year, Kendrick Lamar won for the first time. Before that, Kendrick had never been in the history of the hip-hop brackets, which now there's a history of. Kendrick Lamar had never been past the quarterfinals. So last year, Kendrick Lamar won. The year before that, an MC out of New Orleans, her name is 3D Nati. She is incredible. And for a whole host of reasons, she's not as popular as other MCs, but 3D Nati won last year, beating out Andre 3000, who's, a legend in the field. The year before that, The Game won. Biggie has won once. Andre 3000 has won a couple of times. Lauryn Hill has won. And so we've had some upsets. We always have really big upsets as this happens, but it's a really fun way to get students together. And in this day and age of people doing a lot of things on the go, I try to teach students the skill of just sitting and listening to music. And every music we listen to, we put the lyrics up on screen so you can even more intentionally pay attention to not just what the music sounds like, but what they're actually saying.
Kendrick's having a good year. He just won the Pulitzer Prize.
I know. I mean, he's, I tell my students all the time, he is this generation's nomination to the Hall of Fame, in the Hip Hop Hall of Fame, and maybe even Black Music Hall of Fame. He's just a prolific, incredibly prolific artist.
What can sociologists learn from hip hop artists?
One of the beautiful things about hip hop is that it also gets really close to the stories of people who are going through a lot of things. And so as an ethnographer, I have an affinity with hip hop artists because I feel like we do the same thing. They have to worry about putting their music in verse and making it sound good and all those kinds of things. And I have to sort of put it in nice, beautiful paragraphs and prose for people to read. But I see hip hop artists, at least the best ones, as ethnographers. And they're just painting what's happening in the day-to-day. Now, we need not worry about, are the things completely true? Are they fabricated? They're artists, right? And what artists do is they represent the truth in its most drastic form so we can pay as close attention to it as possible. So I think that's what sociologists and really the general public can learn from hip-hop artists.
What can hip-hop artists learn from sociologists?
And it's the same thing that ethnographers face all the time, is that hip-hop artists are telling stories about 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 people. And that's what we do as ethnographers too. But there's a whole branch of sociology that gives us the really macro, large-scale understanding of these things. The other thing that hip-hop artists can learn from sociologists is we theorize. That is to say, when we tell you the story, we're not just trying to tell you what is happening in these persons' lives. As important as that is, the next step that sociologists often take is that, so what does that then mean? in the grander scale of things. We have the added task of trying to figure out how do we interpret the meaning of these stories that we're collecting.
Another course you teach is entitled Qualitative Research Methods, and you've been referencing this qualitative approach. What is that class about?
In that class, I encourage students to come up with their own research questions and go through what I find to be the beautiful process of collecting data to answer those research questions. I think qualitative methods is really special, especially interview methods. And, I'm enamored with ethnographic research. And so especially ethnographic research. But what it does is that it takes you through the process of how do you get your hands on your own data, and then how do you make sense of it. Undergraduate students, the really bright ones, especially at a place like Davidson, are really good at taking in research, interpreting what it means, and spitting it back to you. It's a whole different ballgame when we say, okay, now I want you to author a piece of research and tell us what it means. So in that class, students pick a topic, they pick a particular brand of qualitative methods, and then they just go at it.
Inhabiting the same space of your subjects and describing them sounds more anthropological than sociological. Why don't you call yourself an urban anthropologist?
We're not ashamed as ethnographers to say that we absolutely and completely stole that method from anthropologists. We're perfectly happy to say that. In fact, as a sociologist, probably the social scientist that I find most akin to is anthropology. It's something that we got from them. There are nuanced distinctions between what I do as a sociologist who's an ethnographer and between me and an anthropologist, but those nuances are really, I don't think really amount to a whole lot. Some people might say I'm an anthropologist, and I wouldn't be offended by that at all. And I hope anthropologists wouldn't be offended by being called ethnographers who are sociologists.
Your approach favors personal experience over data. Is something lost in your research if it is primarily anecdotal and less data-driven?
So if I may, the first thing that I would say to that is that I do collect data, and the thing that I put my hands on, that's what I would call my data. The next step is also to say that we have to think about what large survey data tell us versus what I'm able to tell. And so I think sometimes the charge is that I don't have as many people to talk about. To that, I would simply say, you're just looking at the wrong thing that you're counting. Let me give you an example. So I study food. In my dissertation, I did my research on how people make decisions about what they eat. Survey data, somebody who's doing research with survey data will have 50,000 people answering 2 or 3 questions about how they make decisions about their food. The quantity is in the people. As an ethnographer, I will have 10 people that I look at over a course of 10 months make 50,000 decisions about what they eat. My quantity is not in the number of people, but is in the occurrences of how many times they're making that decision. In some sense, I'm willing to say that I'm observing, if we're just talking about observing how people make decisions about what they eat, I'm observing that occurrence in some ways as often as a survey data person is observing that occurrence. That's one thing. The other thing is that I think survey data is able to tell us really large trends about what's happening. And that's a beautiful thing, right? We need that. What I think I can offer is the mechanisms that explain those trends. And those two have to be there together. So if you find that poor people eat more McDonald's, that's wonderful. Poor people eat more McDonald's than rich people do. That trend is really interesting. But what I'm able to tell you is, well, why is it that poor people eat more McDonald's? Or how is it that lives of poor people get them to eat more McDonald's than the other folks? So I think if you put those two together, that's when we have the most complete of social understandings.
It seems you're making a case for depth over breadth.
I think I am, because that's my contribution to the enterprise. But I think in my writings very often, and there's a sociologist, Mitch Denier, who does this beautifully, what he reminds all of us ethnographers to do when we're writing up our findings is always to zoom out and zoom back down. and then zoom out and zoom back down. I don't do survey research, but in the writings of my research, I do everything I can to make sure that I include as much as possible the best survey researchers about this. And there are people who have the brains, the genius, the resources to do both, right? The brilliance of Matthew Desmond's Evicted is that he collected his own survey data. If he just did that project ethnographically, he would come back and tell the same stories, but we wouldn't believe him as much as we do because he's able to support his wonderful stories with the larger data set that he collects.
How do you know that you're getting your extrapolation right?
What do you mean by that?
When you draw general conclusions from ethnographic data coming from a small sample, how do you know you're getting your extrapolation right?
Excellent. So I think in a lot of my presentations, people ask that same question about generalizability. How do you know that what you're finding in this particular place is generalizable? The honest answer is I don't. I can't prove it. I can't guarantee it. But I would also ask you, is there a reason for me to believe that the case that I'm studying is so distinct from a whole bunch of other cases, right? I went to Jackson, Mississippi, and I looked at it. If somebody made the argument that my findings are not generalizable, I would also ask them to give me reasons why Jackson is so incredibly, particularly unique from a whole host of other places in the country.
Aren't you making the case for stereotyping?
No, I'm not making the case for stereotyping because I think, as the brilliant novelist Chimamanda Adichie said, the problem with stereotypes is not that they're inaccurate, it's that they're incomplete. And so what I can do is to tell you a story about how people make decisions about what they eat. But what I will tell you is that I didn't come to my conclusions by being there 2 days, 3 days, 4 months, 5 months. I was there 13 months. After being with somebody for a week, 2 weeks, me, the observer, is not so important that just my presence is going to change how they conduct their lives. They will go back to their regular lives as they do. And my job, as much as possible, if I'm doing my job right, is to really sink in the backdrops of the scene and watch life happen as it would if I were not there.
When you're immersed in a setting, observing subjects for an extended period of time, how do you avoid not reporting about your own experience as opposed to the experience of the people that you're observing?
I do both. I make sure I report about my experiences as well because I want to be clear that the things that I'm seeing are from my vantage point. In our world, we call it being as reflexive as possible. In the sense that I want to tell you as much about myself so you know that the things that I'm observing are through my lens as a racialized, gendered, immigrant, academic, all those sort of social identities impact the things that I may see or may not see. But the story at the end of the day is not about me. It's about the experiences of the people that I'm around. One of the things to guarantee or to make sure that you're doing those sorts of things as correctly as you can is to take your writing back to the people that you're writing about. And you read it to them. And they hear it and they report back on it. Now, it's not a space where somebody tells me, I don't like this that you said about me. People say that. And then I look at them, I say, is it untrue or do you just not want that reported? If they say they don't want that reported, then I said, well, maybe I need to completely take you out of the study because if I'm going to report it, I'm going to report these sorts of things. But very often when I go back and I share my research findings with my research participants, the best compliment they give me is, wow, you really got everything. Some of those things are kind of hard that you're sort of putting it out there, but you really saw the real thing.
Is qualitative research more literature than science?
That's a very interesting question. As I write it, my best hope, my ultimate goal in life is not to, if I could write something like Du Bois did, I would be happy. But even more than that, if I could write like Richard Wright did, I would be happier. If what I write becomes read as literature, I would take that as a compliment because I think in a lot of ways, literature is able to tell us about ourselves in ways that science can't ever tell us about ourselves. I also don't accept a science in the way that sometimes we think about science, in the experimental, positivist way of science. I just don't buy that. And this gets into questions of ontology and epistemology and all those sorts of things. But I think we just have to embrace a telling of a story, a genuine and sincere telling of a story about human existence, however, whatever shape that takes, in photography, in the best of films, in the best of documentaries, in the best of literature. All those things are really, really important in trying to understand, especially the plight of people who are going through really difficult things. It's no accident that I love the liberal arts spaces, right, and the humanities, but the humanities done in a way that does not even privilege the stories of other groups of people versus other groups of people.
You also teach a course called Contemporary Race Theory. What do you explore in that course?
In that class, we're pretty much thinking about what are the hottest debates right now in American sociology as it relates to race. Before we get into what those topics are, I sort of step back and say, who are what I call the provocateurs? Who are the people who have shaped the debates that we're having? So we read Omi and Wanan's Racial Formation. We read some William Julius Wilson, and then we get into, immigration debates about genetics, debates about intersectionality, debates, like some of the debates that are really taking people's attentions today.
We often hear that race is a sociological construct, that race exists in our minds as an idea. Would we be better served as a society if the idea of race just faded away?
That's a really deep question. Let's step back and think about race as a symbolic categorizing, right? The very human process of grouping things and grouping peoples together. We do that all the time with a whole host of different things. I think the problem is not wanting race to fade away, or that shouldn't be the wish. The wish should be, what would it take for us to continue to recognize the different racialization, but for it to not matter in people's life possibilities as it does? Let me give you another really big symbolic boundaries that we draw. We're in the American South. College football is huge. Alabama fans don't like Clemson fans. That's real. That exists in our minds. Before people go to college, or maybe around here, you're born into the families of these football teams. Those things are really, really important, but they do not determine one's life prospect as much as race does. In my humble opinion, I think we need to, if we could get to a point where race is as real as the distinction between Alabama and Clemson fans, but is not as consequential. So it's not about getting rid of race. It's about making sure it's not as consequential to people's lives.
Words matter. We no longer use the words Negro and mulatto. Those words once had power, and they no longer have power. What if we no longer use the words black and white?
I don't know what that would do for us, because I don't think if we replace it with A and B, and if person A is black and person B is white, and persons A and persons B's lives were still as determined by their A-ness and their B-ness, we're back to the same problem.
Piko, I teach ethics. There is descriptive ethics and normative ethics. Descriptive ethics describes the choices that people make in certain circumstances. Normative ethics considers the choices people should make in certain circumstances. Does your work ever make normative judgments about how marginalized people in urban locations should behave?
No, that's not the object of my research. The object of my research is to really understand how are people making sense of their day-to-day lives. And part of it is just to really take people there and try to make sense of it. It's contextualizing their research, it's contextualizing their decision makings, it's putting it within different levels, what I call the micro, the meso, and the macro context that allows us to understand why people are making the decisions that they're making.
If you don't explore how things should be, do you consider public policy?
I consider public policy in the sense that we say, for me, we're like, here's the context of people's lives and here's how they're making decisions about their lives. Then the next step is to figure out, how do we introduce certain policies that allow them to make different kinds of decisions in the context? I think part of the problem when we get to normative judgments in some ways is that we presume that the peoples in these situations are incapable of making better decisions, or that they are so much unlike us that they're making different decisions. That's way back when we define culture as values. Right? And so when we say the culture of poverty, what we're talking about is presuming that people who live in poverty just inherently have different values. That's just not the case. People are making the best decisions that they can within the context of their lives that they have.
Any mixed emotions about parachuting into poverty as a sociologist and then leaving and returning to the privilege of your campus?
Why do we phrase it as parachuting?
Because you get to leave.
Absolutely. But why not somebody who's going in to try to understand a social problem? And you do have to leave, but you go and you do your part and you do the work, right? The leaving process, I wish more ethnographers wrote about that publicly. It's depression. A lot of people go in there, and the work that folks are in there doing, when you leave, there's an incredible amount of guilt in there, right? It's not something that's taken lightly at all. It's not something that I took lightly. And it's not something that any ethnographer that you speak to, we call it getting out. Getting out is hell. Getting in is easier than getting out. So getting out is intense. So we don't take that lightly at all.
Do you feel guilt getting out?
Yes, I do feel guilt. Everybody does. Anybody that does this work in as intense a way as some of us do it, you absolutely feel guilty when you're leaving.
How do you manage that?
You get a therapist. And you try to keep your eyes on the prize. You try to figure out, you try to always remember the people that you're writing about. You put photos of them in your office. You call back as much as you can, and you go back to visit, and you take your parents back, and you take your loved ones back, but sometimes you don't. Sometimes it keeps people in depression. Sometimes it ends relationships. Sometimes it gets you to be a different person. It changes you. Read the author's note for Evicted again. Read Kimberly Hung's work about this. Read Forrest Stewart's work about this. Read these people who've been in the trenches and have been doing this for a while. It's depression. It's not easy at all, because you get to be very close to really disturbing things. You see people die. People get hurt. You're never the same person.
You're speaking about the work of others and speaking in second person. What about for you?
It gets difficult. It's the same thing for me too. It's hard, and you do everything you can to manage it, but it's difficult, and it's not easy work at all. It's important work. You are always proud of the work that you're doing. You're always excited about the work that you're doing. You always know that your work in some ways is going to make a difference, or at least you hope it does. But you also, if nothing at all, you know that you're putting the lives of certain people who, without your time with them, their lives will never be part of the world's record of human existence. When you spend time with people who are homeless, I know 4 or 5 people who are dead now. And I have their stories, I have their voices, I have their ideas, I have their smiles, I have all of these. And these people, because I'm going to put them in my next book, they will be part of the record of human existence. Without that, they would never be a part of record of human existence. That's what you hang your hat on. But otherwise, you soldier on.
I have to ask you about the movie Black Panther. Have you seen the movie?
I have.
What thoughts crossed your mind watching the movie?
So first, let me say that I'm not a superhero movies person at all, right? So I don't know that genre of film. I love film, but I watch film like I do ethnography. Give me something that's painstakingly about the day-to-day lives of people's lives, and I'm there. Like, so, Moonlight, I was there. Fences, I was there. Like these, even La La Land. I love La La Land. I loved all these films that are just about regular human day-to-day interactions, like, paint drying stuff. That's my kind of spiel. But you had to go see Black Panther. Everybody was talking about Black Panther, so you had to go see Black Panther. It's an event. It's a Black cultural event. And I don't know when was the last time we had something of that magnitude. So it's really, really important. And it was a wonderful thing to have gone seen. So I loved it. I have a whole bunch of other opinions about it, but I love the film. I only went to see it once, which which is not, a lot of people saw it several times, but I loved Black Panther.
You have a unique perspective
Sure.
for a variety of reasons.
Sure.
You're African, you're now an African-American, and you're a sociologist and an ethnographer. Mm-hmm. What did you see on the screen that piqued your interest, or ideas or themes that presented themselves to you that struck you?
So I think the first thing that you have to laud Black Panther for is that it's a very simple story told really well. The presentation of the beauty of Blackness on screen was remarkable, right? I've never seen a film that you're just looking aesthetically. It was a pretty film. It was just really beautifully done, start to finish. Everybody played their parts really, really well. The things about and it's almost blasphemous to almost criticize Black Panther. So you're about to get me in a lot of trouble with all the Wakanda Forever people. I don't know if I'm down with Wakanda Forever. And this is why. One is, as somebody from the continent, what's the representation of the continent in that film? We see London, we see Tokyo. I wanted to see Kampala. I wanted to see Cape Town. I wanted to see Accra. I wanted to see Dar es Salaam. I wanted to see African cities, right? But in Black Panther, Africa is a space that you pass through to get to Wakanda. And Africa, in some ways, is still blighted out, just like all the white movies blight out Africa. So that's one thing. I think the other important thing about Black Panther is to think about the representation of the African diaspora on screen. This goes back to some of the questions that we were talking about earlier about what race is and what race ought to be. And I brought up the idea of symbolic boundaries. For me, that's more important than thinking about any particular kinds of boundary making, but thinking about it more broadly. It's the constant separation of who's the us and who's the them. That's what's killing us. And we just draw a bunch of different lines. We think some of them make more sense than others, but they're all equally as problematic. The us and the them, rich people, poor people, white people, black people, brown people, yellow people, all those, it's that concept. And we do it over and over and over, and we inscribe it in as many different ways as possible. And so I think what I'm talking about here is not particular to Black Panther or particular to Black people or particular to this film. It's just this thing that we all completely and always do. The fact that a marginalized group is doing it is not an excuse for the fact that oppressive groups do it all the time, right? We shouldn't say, because Black people are racist too, therefore racist. No, that's not what this is about. But in the film, how is the experience or the diasporic experience of African Americans represented in the film? Just like Kampala does not show up on screen, just like Cape Town does not show up on screen. When Oakland showed up on screen, Oakland was killed. Maybe he's not dead yet. Who knows, right? But I took issue with that. I took issue with the fact that Wakanda is this space, it's conservative in some ways. It has this tradition of we do this, we do this, we do this, we do this. And at the very beginning, the woman general of the army, she says, look, we need to spend more time saving the world as opposed to here preserving ourselves. Nobody listened to her. And she's like, I don't think I'm going to hold this post for a while. Nobody listened to her. And then the Oakland character comes and it's like, no, I'm going to insist that you do different. And that person gets killed, right? So I think we have to think about how the diaspora gets represented in here. It's a cleaner story. In some ways, it speaks to the perpetual continual marginalization of the Black American experience.
Piko, you grew up in Ghana. What do you remember about your childhood?
I remember everything. I moved here when I was 13, so I still have a really strong, beautiful memories of it. I guess my earliest memories is living in sort of this compound. In Ghana, a bunch of families all lived together in Accra. And my mother working and taking care of us. My father was abroad, but always sending money and, taking care of us in the way that he can. I have sort of distinct memories of going to boarding school. So I went to an international boarding school, which is great. I learned a lot, but I was like 6 or 7, so I just lost everything. Everything that I was, as in like my possessions, or maybe I was like 8 or 9 or something like that. But I would go and like whatever I was sent to school with, I would just come back with none of it because I was just a forgetful kid. And then I remember growing up with my grandmother, my mother's mother. My mom lived elsewhere because my mom lived in a really small village, Agunodobing. And the schools there, in my mom's mind, was not good enough for me. So I had to stay with my grandmother so I can go to a better school, a better private school. And so I know it's cliche sometimes when people, older people would say, we used to walk to school, but, we for real used to walk to school, like 3 miles walk to school. So I know, there's just little things that your parents say that like stick with you. I remember my mom distinctly saying something like, you will always go to the best schools, even if I have to sell everything I own to get you to the best schools. And so if my mom thought that was important for her to promise to sell everything, then I would take school seriously. And I loved school. I had some of my friends that I went to school with, I went to this school in Aguna called Happy Home. It was just the smartest people to this day, the smartest people I've ever been around, the most hardworking, smartest people I've ever been around. And they don't know it. I think they do. I tell them when I go home. Everything that I do today, they motivate me a great deal to do it. Because in some ways, I feel like I was one of the lucky ones that made it to this country and was able to pursue some of the things that I wanted to do.
Your family came here when you were 13 years old?
I grew up, the first part of my life was with my mom in Ghana. When I moved here when I was 13, I moved here to be with my dad. So they both kind of raised me, but at different stages.
And your mom stayed in Ghana?
My mom stayed in Ghana for a long, long time. And my mom lives here now, but my mom was in Ghana for a long time.
And where did you move to in the United States?
In the U.S., my first stop was in Kenton, Illinois. Small-ish town outside of Peoria, Illinois. Farming town. My dad was the pastor for 2 churches, Shields Chapel and Locust Lane United Methodist Churches.
How did you adjust?
It was hard. 8th grade. 8th grade is the worst time to be different, right? So here's an example of how it is, right? I show up in social studies that week. They were studying Africa. And the teacher couldn't pronounce the names of the countries. I had to stand up and pronounce the names of the countries. You're just different. And I actually, and sometimes when I write about my trajectory, I think about those spaces as my first sensibilities of a sociologist. I had to learn how it is to fit into a space. And so I had to learn about the social stratifications of the lunch counter. Or the lunchroom. Some kids sat over there, some kids sat here, some kids sat there. Well, why is it that some kids sat over there? Well, that means some of them were athletes. Some of them spoke this way. Some of them were smart. So I had to deduce that. And then I have to figure out, well, where do I want to sit? Where do I want to put myself? Do I want to align myself with any one of these folks? Or do I want to make it possible for me to go from the proverbial top of the social ladder to the bottom? But it was difficult. And then there was a second sort of transition. I moved from Kenton, Illinois to the South Bronx. And I often say the transition from Ghana to Kenton was easier than the transition from Kenton to the South Bronx. And that's the nature of what America is. America is a vast land with really different pockets of social life. So you get to the Bronx and everything I learned in Kenton was different. Dressed different, listened to different kinds of music, all of that.
You heard a song in the South Bronx that made an impact. What was that song?
Yeah. The song is called Super Thug by Noriega. It got to a point when I think my father, in his brilliance, realized that And this is not to say anything bad of Kenton, Illinois. Is a place that I still have wonderful, wonderful memories of. There are people who are really impactful in my lives and were really great to me. But my dad, in his wisdom and knowing the nature of this country, understood that if a black male in the U.S. is only socialized in Kenton, Illinois, the maneuverings of the world would be different. So he knew that we had to see a different kind of America. And that's why he moved us to the South Bronx. And, the time that I lived in the South Bronx, it was without my father. So my father stayed in Kenton, moved us up there to live with my aunt, while he tried to find a job in New York, because he knew it was important for us to get out. And that means a lot more now since Jordan Peele's movie. Like, we had to sort of get out of there, right? So on the drive to my aunt's house, I hear the song Super Thug Noriega, and it just sort of stopped me in my tracks. And I said, wow, what is this hip hop stuff? I always say it wasn't the first time that I heard hip hop, but it was the first time that I took notice. Because in Kenton, we listened to a lot of Will Smith, and it was great. And to this day, I still love Will Smith. But I learned Super Thug, and it sort of really impacted me and became one of the things that prompted me to write my first book.
What was that book?
First book is called Break Beats in the Bronx, Rediscovering Hip Hop's Early Years.
And what was that book about?
The book is really about the history of hip hop. It's my attempt to retell how hip hop started. The headline of the story is historians of hip hop begin in 1973. They go till 1975, and then they jump to 1979. And when I was in graduate school, I sort of saw this hole, and I asked myself, well, what happened between 1975 and 1979? And I had the great fortune of running into a handful of good data that helped me tell that story. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to do it.
You went to Ithaca College in New York. What do you remember about Ithaca?
Fond, wonderful teachers, fond memories, wonderful. Sean Eversley Bradwell, Jeff Klaus. They changed my life. They literally changed my life. They taught me that I could be a smart young black person, and they were just remarkable. I would not trade my years at Ithaca for anything. And the huge part of my time at Ithaca, the most impactful part, was being an MLK scholar. MLK scholarship was you are to read as much or all of Dr. King's writings, and then every year in January, the school takes you outside of the country where you do a mini research project and you come back and you present it. I do what I do today because I was an MLK scholar.
You then went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison and earned your doctorate. What was your dissertation?
My dissertation took me to Jackson, Mississippi. In Jackson, Mississippi, I wanted to understand how black folks up and down the social economic ladder make decisions about what they eat. I wanted to use how black folks make decisions about what they eat to understand how black folks are living out blackness in the contemporary South.
What question is on your mind these days?
I'd say there are a couple of things that are on my mind. One is Charlotte. Charlotte is on my mind quite a bit. As a relatively new Charlottean, I've come to imagine this place as home. I'm somebody who moves a lot. I've never lived any one place for more than 5 years. And I think this might be the place that I live for more than 5 years. I live in Charlotte now. I'm getting married in Charlotte soon. I think about what Charlotte is going to be for my children. Where will I send my children to school? Will my children want to live in Charlotte? Where will they want to live? If my children, who will presumably be middle class, what's their economic mobilities? What is that going to look like? Are they going to be able to keep that trajectory? Or just like all of the data is telling us, will they slip down into lower classes? So that's really interesting and important for me as I sort of project myself into the future. And so I've gotten a bunch of undergraduate students doing some research to try to help think about what Charlotte is and what it's becoming. So that's one set of things. The other set of things is really also looking back into my life, into immigration. So I'm thinking about my next research project. Then it's going to be about immigration and the experiences of Ghanaian immigrants. So I'm going back home this summer, spending a month there, doing sets of interviews with my dad and some family members. And really I'm trying to think about, in the long run, really personally, was immigration good for my family or was it bad for my family? Not just for me. I know I've gained a great deal from it, but I have a lot of cousins and different persons around the world. Really, I have family members in Italy and Sydney and London. What did immigration do for us as a family? And in a really large scale, can or does immigration solve the international disparities that exist between countries?
Piko, what matters most to you?
That's a deep question. There's a book by an education scholar named Lisa Delpit. The book is called Other People's Children. I've never read the book, but I love the title of that book so much. What matters to me is, how do we get to a point where we're not driven so much by the symbolic boundaries that we create? That is to say, what matters to me is to figure out how we can treat other people's children like our children. If we did that, we would be as worried about the poor schools that other people's children go to. We would be as worried about the fact that other people's children are getting shot by the police. We would be as worried about the fact that other people's children live in places in this world where they don't have enough to eat. That matters to me. Now, I'm not a parent. I hope to be someday, but I hope when I have a child, I will value them as every parent values their own child, but I will also think about ways to value other people's children as much as I value my own children.
Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Joseph Piko Ewoodzie Jr. is the Malcolm O. Partin Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and Sociology at Davidson College. He earned a BA in Sociology from Ithaca College and an MS and Ph.D. in Sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And now, a personal word. When I asked Piko about how he feels being able to leave behind the marginalized people whose stories he tells, I opened up something raw and very emotional in him. There is a cost to the work he does, immersing himself in the lives of other people, and then returning to his own life. It is a cost that very few people know about. It is a cost he bears to make sense of the world and to change it for the better. Piko has spoken publicly about living for months among different classes of African Americans in Jackson, Mississippi. In a presentation he gave to the Southern Food Alliance, Piko reported on the social forces that impact the ability of African Americans to get something to eat. He used the term foodways, shorthand for food availability, food choice, and food consumption. He embedded himself for several months among groups of homeless people, the working poor, middle income, and upper middle class persons. He spent all his waking hours participating in and observing their lives. Piko's talk to the Southern Food Alliance focused on his time living specifically among homeless people in Jackson. The question that drove him was, what is the price homeless people pay to eat? What do they have to give up? Piko's answer? The homeless have to give up on their lives. They have to give up on who they once were in order to get something to eat. Piko spent months at a local shelter with homeless people. He met Smack and Lee, who schooled Piko on how to live on the streets, and Charles, who told Piko his story of how he became homeless, of drug use and addiction, of being in prison, of losing jobs, of shame and disgrace, of fouling out, of Satan having a hold on him, of no longer having hope, of becoming broken and docile in order to stand in line at a soup kitchen. Piko stood at the podium at the Southern Food Alliance in front of an audience, bringing Smack and Lee and Charles to life. He became their voice. He helped listeners understand them and themselves. Ethnography is field-based research. It employs participation and observation and interviewing to investigate social forces and practices. Ethnology compares cultures in as natural way as possible. The data is descriptive. The work is narrative. Ethnographers tell stories. Many years ago, I read Nickel and Dimed, or Not Getting By in America, by Barbara Ehrenreich. The book is a memoir of Ehrenreich's fieldwork surviving on minimum wage, living as a waitress, hotel maid, house cleaner, nursing home aide, and Walmart clerk. The book exposed the plight of the working poor, economic injustice, and the underbelly of capitalist exploitation. On My Bedside is Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City by Matthew Desmond. A Harvard sociologist, Desmond lived in the poorest neighborhoods of Milwaukee, investigating the housing crisis engulfing poor communities. Desmond tells stories of renters and landlords, of the effects of evictions on mental health and on the fabric of entire neighborhoods. The book is a landmark ethnographic report on the affordable housing crisis in America. In Evicted, Desmond wrote this line about the emotional toll of his work. Quote, "I feel dirty, collecting these stories and hardships like so many trophies." End quote. I don't know how Piko Ewoodzie, or Barbara Ehrenreich, or Matthew Desmond reconcile the conflicts inherent in their work. And there are moral conflicts, as ethnographers often profit from the stories they tell about marginalized people. But I do know this, that Piko and Barbara and Matthew and sociologists in the field are brave. They are bearing witness. Their reports are acts of love, with all the emotional turmoil and conflicts that love often entails. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Additional support for this podcast is provided by the UNC College of Arts and Architecture, celebrating a decade of creative education in the arts and design. Thank you to our funding partners, and to my teammates, Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, art and media director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value at a level you choose. Visit us also on our website, onlifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.